Hi, this is Goichi. Welcome to the doorway to the word. Well, today's doorway is to the life of David, King David in the Bible. I'm not talking about David next door. Well, at last, I'm gonna talk about this very popular figure, David. Well, I think David is most popular character in the Bible, of course, other than Jesus. And if you ask Christians, who is your favorite character in the Bible other than Jesus? Probably 8 out of 10 people would say David. And then they have many reasons, I suppose. But he's so popular. Even non-Christians have heard about David and Goliath. You know, the children's stories there. And people talk about it. And many teachings. And many books are written. Many teachings have been done. And preachers preached. And many studies been done, and you can find many books in the bookshops and many teachings and preaching on the internet, and I really recommend you to go through that, find one, because everybody's got different opinions and different views over David, and it's so great to study someone like this, special guy really. And you know, this special guy, there are many stories there that the people know. Many events of the David's life. But can you name some? Probably you can say, oh yeah, Goliath's incident. David, when he was young, killed just this giant Goliath with a sling and stones. Or you might say, oh, he wrote many psalms. Or he had an affair with Bathsheba. And that kind of things. But those events, famous events, are only a small part of David's life. And there are many more things happened in his life. And when you look into those things in his life which is not so well known, you can find what makes him so special. So we're gonna have a look at the life of David, King David, and find out what makes him so special, what makes him so recommended by God, and why he's so popular. And I think it's a good thing to do. But you know, we're gonna find out David's life now in this session, and you can read his life story in the book of Samuel and First Kings, and it's a bit in this Chronicles as well. But you know, David's life is someone's life. You're talking about someone's life. It's very long, isn't it? Won't be able to fit in half an hour or one session. So I'm going to talk about this life of David in 4 different sessions. I'm going to call them episodes, 4 episodes. And the first episode, we're going to look at his early life, his birth and when he was young, and relationship with King Saul and Jonathan, the king's son. And episode 2, we're going to have a look at David during the time of exile, and how all those men gathered around him and helped him to become a king. And in episode 3, we're going to look at David as a king, the reigning king of Israel. And he had many blessing, glory, and also the falls as well. So we're going to have a look at that. And also episode 4, the final episode, we're going to have his latter life, where he was getting old, the generations changing. And also we're going to summarize and find out what makes David so special. So, first session, this one, you think it's going to be episode 1? No. This is episode 0, the prologue, rather, of David's life. And this is the introduction. So I'm going to call it episode 0, introduction today. Well, you know, as I said, we're going to look at someone's life. It's someone's history. And when you look at the history, any history study you do, it's best to look at what happened before that particular time you're going to study or you're going to have a look at. And because that the history events happens because what happened before. Always something happens now leads to the future. something happening now is because something happened past. So always look at the past history. And also, it's good to know the background of this particular time David lived. Because often when you find all those stories, all those teachings and preaching, they pick up certain part of David's life and certain event or incident, and they're going to talk about, they preach and teach and talk about the spiritual application from the particular time, and which is great. And then many of them there, as I said, and you should go have a look. But to understand it much deeper, it is great to know what's going on behind the scenes, what the culture and what the political atmosphere is like. Especially this particular time, the Israel and the surrounding country had many wars and conflict. They all had different agendas, and then especially this King David's time, is Israel's political and governmental system has very much changed from previous era. And this was very much of the turning point of Israel. And we need to know what has been happening. So we're going to have a look at the time before King David and time before the King Saul, the first king of Israel. Time of Judges. We're going to have a look. But if you want to know the detail of the time of Judges, I did the sessions before, so you can go to Kladai Community Church Apostolic Center Facebook or Kladai Community Church Apostolic Center YouTube channel. You can find the teaching on that. So you can find a little bit more about the time of Judges. So, episode 0, introduction, the background of the time of David. Well, it was a time of Judges. Do you know the time of Judges came after Abraham came to the Canaan? And couple of generations passed, the generation's time of Jacob, and there was a famine went on. So they, or the family and tribe of Jacob, they moved to Egypt, the north of Egypt, and they stayed there for 400 years. Obviously, Jacob didn't live for 400 years. Generations passed, and they went to slavery. And at that time, God raised up Moses and delivered them Israelites out of Egypt. That's the Exodus. And they wandered around the desert for 40 years, and one generation passed and went into the land of Canaan. They're back into the promised land, led by Joshua. And after the Joshua conquered the land, people settled, the 12 tribes had the land, settled their borders. Then Joshua's generation died out, and here comes the time of Judges. What happened is, the Israelites, after Joshua, they started to forget about God. They started living according to how they fit, not necessarily God's way. So God let the enemy surrounding countries affecting them in order to bring them back to God. So Israelite was plundered and tormented by surrounding countries like Ammonite, etc., etc. You know, Moabite, Ammonite, Philistine, etc. Those countries, and people cried out, and God raised up judges. People called judges. They are the leaders to deliver Israel from those enemies. So that's what happened. And then generation after generation after generation, they did the same things. You know, forgot about the God. The enemy came, cried to God. The judges came and delivered, had a peace, and then they forgot about God, etc. Kept on and on for some generations. So that's the time of Judges, pre-kingdom era, you can call it if you want. And at that time, Israel had no king. They were governed by, as I said, judges who were appointed by God. This is very important. They were appointed by God, chosen by God. Okay, what's the difference between kings and judges? That's a question I had. I had a look. And the Bible actually clearly says in 1 Samuel 8, God explained what kings do. But this is simplified version of what I find out. Kings, they rule over people. They can demand tax from people. They can demand people to be a soldier, the conscription. They can demand that. They actually, with the power and authority, rule over people. Of course, if people had a good king who rule over, they have a good life, peaceful life, because kings are merciful and good. But if they had bad king, selfish, and corrupt king, it would be hell. You can imagine. You see, but kings, they rule over. How about judges? Judges, they lead people. You see, they were chosen by God and they lead the people to do God's will. That might be leading people to the war to deliver them from all those enemies, or defend the country from those enemies, leading people in a righteous life way. You see, the judges led and administered God's will to people of Israel. They did not claim any tax from people. They did not force people go to become a soldier for the war either. If you read the book of Judges, those judges requested those people in different tribes to join the war. So that's why the certain tribes didn't join the war. You know, you can read that in the story of Deborah, and you can read it in the story of Gideon, that kind of things, you know. Some judges are loner, like Samson, but nevertheless, they never claimed the tax of people or forcefully conscript soldiers, that kind of things the kings would do. So that's a difference. And interesting, isn't it? Nation of Israel. Let's have a look at this about that time of Judges. Nation of Israel didn't have a king. So how was it like? All other surrounding countries, Philistines, Moabites, Amorite, Hittite, all those guys, they had a king. You know, they had kingdoms, but Israel didn't have a kingdom. They had 12 tribes, and each tribe had their own land allocated. And plus, Levites lived in different cities scattered all over Israel, because Levites didn't have their own land. You can read that in the Bible. Well, but one thing the united Israel was the law of Moses. According to the law, they recognized themselves as Israelite, but they were not that much united as you imagine. As I said, each region was very much independent, autonomous, and they had their own rules and their own laws, like common laws, to defend and to keep their interest. So they're very much like each region, like tribe of Judah, the land of Judah, land of Ephraim, the land of Asher, all those things, places are very much independent. But overall, they were seen as Israel, but they are very independent, 12 independent states rather. So it's a bit like modern day United States of America. Each state of America has their own state law, but they are united as a United States of America under the federal law and Constitution of America. You see, it was a bit like that. So each tribes, sometimes they allied and helped each other, but often they didn't. How can I say it? Where can I find out about that? Well, you can read in Judges, chapter 17 and 21. They actually fought against each other. Even the Danites kind of annihilated some other towns they're marching through. Towards the end of Judges, the Benjamite, one of the tribes, are almost annihilated by all other tribes in Israel. You see, clearly you can see that each tribes fought and each regions for themselves. Okay, so that was the situation of Israel, and they are facing many threats from surrounding countries at the time. And those countries are like, it's named a few, that's Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, Ammonites, Arameans, and Hittites. All those names are mentioned. And they all saw Israel as a place to plunder. They saw this Israel, and they thought, oh my goodness, those people living there, but they don't have a king. They're not as united as we might think. And if we go for each regions, others might not help them. So that's why, story of Gideon, and you can read all those Moabites suddenly come plunder each seasons. That kind of thing happens. And not necessarily those Israelite tribes, each tribes are helped by others either. So it was a really good target for other countries come to plunder, isn't it? But also, Israel had a different governmental system as I'm talking. All other countries, the surrounding area, they were kingdoms. But Israelite, their governmental system is much more like republics. You see, no kings, see? Even though they had leaders, like prime minister, as judges, as like leaders, but they are much more like republics, different political governmental system. That could be the threat. Or, surrounding countries might see it as a threat to their way of living either, as well. So, that was kind of a political balance, the situations happening of that time. They didn't get on much. And Israel was always facing all those threats from surrounding countries. And they did not have a great army or anything like that. So, around that, the little side, I'm going to sidetrack a little bit, like someone like Hittite, historically, when you look at the Hittite, they were the very much military-based country. They had a chariot, they had iron weapons. They are one of the first one organized, particularly the mobilized old iron weapons as a part of their military systems. And of course the chariot, very strong country military. Arameans, interesting, Arameans, they were the great traders. They traded from east to west around the area. It was so much so, their language became a common language of the area, Aramaic. You see, Aramaic came from this Aramean, all the writings that speaking. And in this Aramaic, even the Israelites spoke when they're speaking to the foreigners. And even the time of Jesus, they spoke Arameans, coming from the Arameans. You see? And Edomites, Moabites, they're descendants from Esau and Lot. You see, Edomites from Esau, then the Moabites from Lot, the Abraham's nephew, Lot. The Esau, the Jacob's brother, used to be the same family, but it scattered and they became enemies. See, Ammonite, well, they want those shells that the kind of spiral, the Ammonites, and the Philistines, of course, they're on the Mediterranean coast of Israel, the land of Canaan. Actually, some theory says they came from a Mediterranean Sea. You see, they were sea people, and those people are surrounding country of Israel at that time. And time of Judges went on for generations, as I say. And the last judge was Samuel. He's a prophet, and the last judge, very much respected by people. And the thing is, even the great judge like that, Samuel, he got old. And he felt it's time to retire, time to pass on the mantle. The thing is, God did not appoint next judges. Samuel did appoint next judges. Who are they? Samuel appointed his sons as next judges. Do you remember at the beginning I said judges were appointed by God, chosen by God? But this time the judges of Israel are appointed by Samuel. And this wasn't very good move actually, because Samuel's sons, even the greater father as Samuel, sons were corrupt. And Bible said these sons are very corrupt, and the people did not like corrupt judges. And also, I reckon that the people might have felt much more threat from surrounding country with weak judges to lead them. You know, if you have a weak leader and there's a threat outside, probably they felt very uneasy about this. So, what did people do? People demanded to have a king to rule over them. And those kings, they said, we want a king like any other countries, or the surrounding countries. You know, you can read in 1 Samuel 8, verse 6 and verse 19, they said, we want kings like other countries. Wow. What a thing to say, hey? This is important. They were stepping out God's will. You see, it was not God's will or God's plan for Israel to have any kings. God clearly said this in the Bible. He said, I am God, I am the king over Israel, and I appoint judges to lead you guys. Yeah? That's what God says in the Bible. So clearly, it wasn't God's will. But people of Israel wanted to step out God's will and have a king of their own, like any others. Well, interesting, isn't it? In God's plan, God is a king who's the one who rule over people. And we all know God is good. He's a good, merciful, righteous king. And that's the best way, the best leader, best king to have. And God appointed the chosen judges who lead people to administer God's will over the land. So that's the kind of model that God has. And God still has that model for us. That's why we Christians are called the ecclesia. And we are the ones who administer God's will on this earth. Like judges. Our King, Jesus Christ, He's a king. God is a king all over this earth, all over the universe. And we are chosen by God, Christians. We are chosen by God, like judges, to administer His will, to do the work. You see? And that's always His plan. And God chose people of Israel, the nation of Israel, to show this particular model of governmental system. But now, people said, we don't want that. Do you know what they're saying? Do you know what God said to Samuel? God said, Samuel, they didn't reject you, they rejected me. Interesting, isn't it? Same word in the New Testament. Jesus said, world rejected me. You see? You know, people of Israel, what they're saying, they didn't want be God's holy people. Holy people means the chosen, specially chosen people for God. And that's what they were. You know, when Moses took them out from Egypt, God told Moses and the Israelites, you are my holy nations, you are my holy people. You see, God said, you are my special ones. But here, people saying, I don't want to be God's special. We don't want to be God's special. We want to be like any other people, like common people. We like a norm. we don't want to be special. That's what they're saying. That's why God said, they rejected me. I chose you because I love you. I chose you as a special. Why do you want to be like any other? Well, but people insisted, sadly. Samuel actually warned them what it means to have a king over you. He said, kings will demand your tax, hard-earned money, put you into labor, the hard labor, forced labor, and your sons will be taken up and conscription, and then made a soldier, sent to war and get killed. If you got a bad king, they will demand you everything. God, the good king, wouldn't. But you still want king like any other countries. And people said, yes, I do. Or we do, they said. And you know what? God said, let them have him. Let them have a king they want. Interesting, isn't it? You know, I always puzzled, wondered God's will, and what's actually happening doesn't seem like God's will. And I talked about a few people in the churches, and they're interesting. We reckon God is much bigger, and His will, His plan is always there. I tell you something. It was never God's will for the human being to fall into sin, like started with Adam and Eve, but we did. You see, God's will wasn't happening there. But I believe, when we're stepping out of His will like that, and when we repent, through mercy and grace, God always will bring us back into His will. I think that's why it's called grace. For example, we fell, as I said, into the sin. Human being fell into the sin. But God provided us the way out of the sin, back into His will. And it's called Jesus Christ. The form of God became a man. Through Jesus Christ, you see, He brought us back in sin, into His promise, that His will from the sin. You see, why is it happening? Why we go against His will? And why did God let people have the way which is not according to His will, like Israelites having a king? We fall into the sin. I believe it's partly because God gave us a free will as human beings. God wants us to love Him freely according to our free will. God doesn't want us to be a robot, the program to love God, but He wants us to love Him from our own heart, which is free will. You see, that's why God let us experience sometimes our bad decisions of stepping out of His will, so that when we experience the consequences of the stepping out of His will, we can start to see and recognize the goodness of His will, His ways, His plans. And when we recognize this, and we come to repent, and then we said, we want to go back into your will, God, He always brings us back. He shows us a way to go back to His will, so that we can walk into His blessing and taste goodness. You see, and God did that. Even though God gave Israelite the king, first king, the King Saul, he was a ruler chosen by people. I know he was appointed by God, anointed by God, but he was very much charismatic among the people. And he was a king, just like king from any other country that they wanted, and God gave them that. But through that, people experienced the wars and everything. We're going to have a look at that as we look into David's life. Then, after that, God raised up David, man after God's heart. You see, his redemptive plan kicked in. You know, interesting current situations, a lot of things happening in the world. And sometimes the things happen not the way we want it, not the way you want it. People might get chosen, or people might get appointed, or the things might happen the way that you believe not in God's will. But that kind of thing happens. Why? You know, God gave whole this earth into the hand of human beings. You can read that in Genesis 1 verse 28. God made a man, put the man there to take care of his creation. And God gave man authority. You see, God said, take a dominion over this, hold this creation on this earth. Take care of it. I give you authority to do this. You know, you can read that in the New Testament when Satan talked to Jesus, man gave me that authority they had from God. Of course, Jesus took that back and gave it to us. Gave back to us. You see? So what we lose on this earth will be loosed. What we bind, and what, you know, will be bind in the spiritual realm as well. You see? So, and then also, as I said, because of the free will God's given us, God let us have this, our choice. And we can taste that our choice. And we can recognize God's goodness. And we can go back to it. You see, sometimes things we don't understand, but we have to believe God still has his plans. Always. He has a grace to bring us back into the right path and into his will. So, keep praying. Keep asking God. And sometimes God said, be still. No, I am God. I'm doing something great. It ain't over yet. You see? So, what's happening? Back in the story. Samuel was asked to find the king by God for those people. The king they want. Okay, so God told Samuel, gave him a little direction. He said, go to this route and you'll meet this guy. And Samuel finds Saul, the Benjamite. Interesting. And Samuel anointed him as a king of Israel. Who was Saul then? Who was Saul? He was a Benjamite. You see, Benjamin, the tribe Benjamin was the smallest tribe of Israel. Out of all the tribes, they were smallest. And you can see why they're smallest in Book of Judges, chapter 20 and 21. They are the ones that almost annihilated in a civil war by all other 11 tribes because of what they've done, the horrible things they done. But anyway, so they were the one of the smallest and weakest tribe of that time, Benjamin. Even though they're the great soldiers there, but they're smallest, and Saul was from there. And also we can find out, and in the book of Samuel, that Saul was from the prominent family of Benjamin. He said his father was a man of standing, and also Saul was handsome and tall. Handsome, tall, handsome, that guy. But anyway, he was so kind of the guy from this rich, nice, good family, you know. But the Bible doesn't mention much of his quality of his character. You see, he doesn't talk about his character, the quality of his character, other than later God made him charismatic among the people. You see, people are so said, oh, impressed. Wow, is that actually Saul? He's prophesying with all those prophets and stuff. You know, it was pleasing to people's eyes. God made him that way, so that the people can have the king they wanted, like any other kings of any other world, surrounding countries. So, Saul became the first king of Israel. That's a turning point of country of Israel. There's a new nation of Israel was born. You see, they used to be like a republic, but now become a kingdom. Interesting. We're gonna have a little bit about dynamics of the relationship with God and the people from Abraham to this time kings. You see, Abraham to Joseph, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and those guys, yeah? Around time, very much family oriented. They were family of Abraham, really. And God and just family of Abraham. That was the dynamics of Israel then. You see, God as a ruler, and there's a family follow God. And at the time of Moses and Joshua and Judges, there's a God there, ultimate ruler. Then God appointed leaders like Moses, Joshua, and all the judges to administer God's will for the people. So there's a God the ruler, judge the leader, and the people of Israel. So that was the dynamics. But now, time of kings, that changed. Used to be God as a ruler, not anymore. There's a human king as a ruler, and there's a subject, the nation of Israel. And God was somehow out of this dynamics, because that's what the people wanted. That's why God said, I'm rejected by those people. And this is the new, you see, from Abraham till time of Judges, God the ruler, leader, nation. But now, whole new political governmental system brought in the king and nation. And in the world's point of view, this autonomous tribal society became united as one nation. That became a threat to surrounding countries, you see, because now these 12 regions got together, put the monies in. The king has the revenue to develop the weapons. He had the authority to gather the army, to conscript the army. It never happened before. You see, it used to be those surrounding countries facing one region, which is probably something like 10,000 people, 20,000 people. Now it's got millions of people to face, you see. So this change of governmental system of Israel, one nation, brought such a diplomatic change in a diplomatic attitude between Israel and surrounding countries, vice versa. You see, for the surrounding nations, Israel used to be a subject of plunder. It's a target to go in and plunder and ransack it, raid it, and come back, you see. But now Israel became a threat to the nations. Their new government, new power, and this multitude of the soldiers and the armed forces, you see, become a threat. You know, they might think, oh, they might invade or in our countries. You see, so for the surrounding countries, Israel became a bit of a threat, much more the threat. And for Israel, their attitude must have changed as well, because they used to be afraid of all those countries. You know, those countries are something to fend off, and we're going to defend our country. But now, these countries are something they could go to war against. There's a big difference there. So since this change of governmental system, that Israel had been involved in war. You see, before this time of kings, in time of judges, when judges are alive, Israel had a peaceful period, peaceful time. Bible tells us, because a good righteous leader appointed by God, and they led the people in a righteous way of life, and also because God was with them, they could defend their countries, and they had a period of peace times. But since they became a kingdom, Israel has been involved in a war against surrounding countries all the time. You can read that in the book of Samuel, until David solidified the borders in his old age. And this wartime went on approximately over about 50 years. Over 50 years of constant conflict with other countries. That's what Israel had since they had kings. Interesting, isn't it? Suddenly, everything changed when they rejected God and demanded to have a king. But God, remember, God is good. God would bring them back into his will. And that's the time David was born and became a king of Israel. So this is the end of episode 0, the introduction. And next one, we're going to talk about David's earlier episode 1, New Hope. We're going to get on. Talk about life of David from next one. So, see you next time. See you in episode 1. Goodbye.